Understanding the past provides perspective for the future. Main Street Landing, Melinda Moulton and Lisa Steele, in 1984 commissioned a 3-projector, 600 slideshow on the history of Burlington's waterfront. Now this rich history on DVD can be shared. Our story opens with an early etching that depicts Native Americans on Lake Champlain. The lake provided a contested boundary between 2 great Indian confederations, the Algonquin to the northeast and the Iroquois in the southwest. The Native Americans helped the European colonists when they first came to America. The Algonquins shared their tradition of maple sugaring with the French. Waterways were the natural yet dangerous highways of the New World because they offered fast and efficient travel for hunting and war parties. Lake Champlain was a contested area, and Native Americans concerned about being attacked settled away from the water's edge. Their longhouses were built on high ground and were protected by stockades. This is not the French explorer Samuel de Champlain, but the portrait used extensively in American textbooks. It's actually a 17th century Parisian actor. Champlain founded Quebec City in 1608, and the next year, in 1609, was led down the St. Lawrence River, led by his Algonquin allies, to the lake, which he claimed for France. When Samuel de Champlain explored the lake, he helped his Algonquin allies win a battle against their enemies, the Iroquois at Crown Point. This was the beginning of the French and Indian War. The war between the French and the English, each supported by rival Indian allies, continued on the lake for the next 150 years. The French Jesuit priests helped secure allegiance from native tribes by converting them to Catholicism. In 1757, the French general Montcalm had over 2,000 Indians under his command when he captured Fort William Henry and drove the British off Lake George. The French were unable to control their Indian allies, who slaughtered the British after their surrender. Montcalm abhorred the killing and never again trusted his Indian allies. The English, in retaliation for the massacre, allowed Rogers Rangers to attack and destroy the Abenaki village of St. Francis in the St. Lawrence Valley. In 1758, the French general Montcalm successfully defended Fort Carillon from an overwhelming British attack. At that time, there were few Indians supporting his 4,000 French regulars. During these 150 years of war and massacre, French fur trappers were frequently exploring the lake and its tributaries. Their French names and explorations are etched timelessly on the old maps from the mid-17th century. In 1759, the French retreated from the lake because their capital, Quebec City, was besieged by the British, being led by Major General Wolfe. A second British force under the leadership of Lord Geoffrey Amherst took control of Crown Point and Fort Carillon. Fort Carillon was renamed by the British Fort Ticonderoga. The British victory signaled the end of the French and Indian Wars and ushered in a decade of peace. British settlers came up the lake and homesteaded. The settlement pattern of St. John was typical because land was cleared from the lake shore inward. As early sawmills, like this one at Fort Anne, developed along the water's edge, the logs from the cleared land provided settlers with the lumber for buildings and boats. By 1775, the American Revolution was underway. Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys are often depicted capturing Fort Ticonderoga from the British. But, truth be told, Benedict Arnold, an American general, was also in command of its capture. Benedict Arnold and his American troops raced north to the Richelieu River and captured the King's sloop from the British at St. John, becoming the masters of Lake Champlain. The American Congress then authorized Arnold and his forces to invade the British in Canada. By spring of 1776, the Americans were beaten back across the border, and they retreated to Fort Ticonderoga. Throughout the summer of 1776, Benedict Arnold built an American fleet at the southern end of the lake in what was then Skenesboro, New York, but is now Whitehall. Arnold sailed north to patrol the lake, and as the cold winds of autumn began to blow, the small American fleet sought shelter for the night behind Valcour Island, just south of the Canadian border. There they were when a stronger British flotilla, which included the British 18-gun sloop Inflexible, sailed right past the Americans. Upon seeing the Americans, the British then had the disadvantage of having to fight back against the wind to attack the American line. Only darkness saved the Americans from being annihilated by the British. Under the cover of darkness, Arnold managed to row his surviving boats through the British line and race in retreat and defeat down the lake towards the protection of Fort Ticonderoga. Overtaken before he could reach Crown Point, Arnold scuttled his remaining ships in what is now called Arnold Bay. Although a defeat, this battle was fought in the autumn and thus delayed the British from invading America for another year. The Americans had the much-needed time to strengthen their army and defeat the British at the Battle of Saratoga the following year, where again it was Arnold's leadership that won the battle. In 1780, the British mapped and plumbed the Burlington lakefront, which they called Great Eagle Island Bay. American independence brought peace and tranquility to the Champlain Basin. Logs were tied together to make rafts, which the settlers lived on while they guided them to mills. Whiteface is plainly visible in this rendering. Cleared land extended from the lake around the homesteads, like the Holly House at Kingsland Bay. In 1798, at the home of Gideon King, the so-called admiral of the lake because of his commercial fleet of 50 boats, a subdivision plot plan for Burlington settlement was drawn up. These plot lines are still used today. In 1807, Robert Fulton changed the world by making punctual travel possible. He patented his steamboat, the Claremont, which offered the first regularly scheduled transportation service on the Hudson River. 2 years later, the steamship named the Vermont was launched at the foot of King Street. Robert Fulton allowed the Vermont to operate without patent infringement because its owners, the Winnan brothers, built Fulton's boat, the Claremont. Commerce along the lake exploded, and warehouses like these at Basin Harbor were served by the sloops and trading schooners plying the waterway with their goods. In 1810, Burlington City Hall Park was located just up the hill from the wharf, known as Salt Dock. Today, the Salt Dock is Perkins Pier at the end of Maple Street. Amid homes with open pastures, there are 3 bridges that connected the lake across a gully that cut Burlington off from the countryside: Shelburne Road to the south, Williston Road to the east, and Pearl Street that leads to Winooski. In 1810, ports around the lake were competing for commerce. Ports like St. Albans Bay in Vermont, Plattsburgh, Essex, and Whitehall in New York. But war clouds were again gathering, and the next war with Britain, the War of 1812, would soon engulf the lake. Young Lieutenant Thomas McDonough was dispatched to Lake Champlain to take command of the Northern American forces garrisoned in Burlington. A British squadron bombarded the city, but was driven off by the cannons on the bluff, henceforth named Battery Park. Looking for a safer location to winter and to build a fleet to challenge the British, McDonough settled in Vergennes, which was located safely 7 miles up the Otter Creek. The Moncton Iron Works, with its foundry and blast furnace located in Vergennes, was indispensable in the creation of American warships. Within 6 months, a squadron of American ships emerged onto the lake, led by the 26-gun Saratoga. The fleet anchored in Plattsburgh Bay, just up the lake from Valcour Island. McDonough, now promoted to acting commodore, let the British fleet sail right past them. Again, the British had to fight against the wind to come back to engage the anchored American line. Commodore McDonough, at this critical moment, swung his flagship Saratoga around on preset cables to bring a fresh broadside to bear against the British. The Americans were victorious. This naval victory stopped the British advance from Canada and assured American control of northern New England. The captured British ships were towed south to Whitehall, where they sat and eventually sank into the lake and its history. With the end of hostilities, lasting peace settled into Lake Champlain. Farms stretched south from Burlington toward Shelburne Point, and war became but a memory. Travelers were able to take a steamship to or a ferry from the ruins of Fort Ticonderoga. Commerce boomed as crops and goods were brought to Burlington, and the waterfront expanded from a single wharf to 3. Fulton's monopoly on steamboats was over, and rival boats of all sizes competed for passengers. Burlington development emerged from the lake. An old steamship, perhaps the Vermont or Phoenix, was tied up in front of John Winnen's house. And standing out against the sky, University Hall. And great churches are beginning to define the city's skyline. Steamboats competed for passengers who traveled to and from towns along the lakeshore, while the ferry shuffled back and forth across the lake to support developing roads and inland towns. Smaller boats shuffled people up and down the connecting rivers. At the end of 1823, the Champlain Canal was open for barge travel from Whitehall to the Hudson River. Unheralded, the Champlain Canal was operating 2 years before the Erie Canal and transformed commerce on Lake Champlain. The Champlain Canal was 62 miles long and connected Vermont directly to New York markets. The canal was only 4 feet deep in some places. Some early canal boats were barges, and they needed a steamboat to tow them. However, most canal boats utilized the wind. In 1826, the venerable Champlain Transportation Company, the CTC, bought out Gideon King and then launched its first steamship, the Franklin, heralding the beginning of the company's operations. The General Green was a new competitive steamboat on the lake during this era. And yet, this 1950s postcard falsely identifies the General Green as the Vermont, declaring it the first steamboat on the lake. Similar to the false portrait of Samuel D. Champlain, careless visual history can skew our historical record. Viewed from Williston in the mid-1830s, the first section of the Burlington Breakwater was built, which made the city's harbor the best among all the rival ports on the lake. As commerce grew and the breakwater was lengthened, the stage was set for Burlington to become the dominant economic center on the lake. The Champlain Transportation Company, in its effort to monopolize lake travel, was forced to keep purchasing and paying off its rivals. Economic prosperity was shining on the lake's queen city, Burlington. The steady demand for steamboat service boomed. The waterway connection from New York to Canada was complete when the Chambly Canal opened in 1843, but the surprise flow of traffic was the Canadian canal boats surging onto the lake, bringing raw lumber to Burlington. In 1844, Judge Timothy Follett Shipping Company, Follett and Mayo, standardized the design for canal boats, and he built a fleet of them. His company dominated canal shipping, and Mr. Follett made a fortune. And there were new steamship consortiums challenging the Champlain Transportation Company's dominance. There were price wars, steamship races, and skullduggery. The rivalry peaked with the Comstock Wars. Peter Comstock challenged the CTC's boat, the Burlington, with his boat, the Francis Saltus. Which boat would win the title, the fastest on the lake? Amid heavy betting, crowds erupted from the waterfront bars to proclaim the Francis Saltus the victor. It's hard to imagine these ruckus times in the bucolic View from the Hill etching of 1846, showing the fields giving way down the hill to the streets of Burlington and the lake beyond. 2 twin flagpoles, like ship masts, towered over City Hall Park. The flagpoles herald the importance of shipping to Burlington. The Hotel Burlington looked out upon the twin mast-like flagpoles, and City Hall Park's grass was protected from grazing by the turnstile cattle gate to keep the cattle out. Looking southwest along Main Street is a fenced border of another Burlington landmark known as Grassmont. It dominated the hill with its orchards reaching down toward the lake and the Potwin Estate. To the south, amid the open landscape, a handful of homes stretched south toward Willard Street and Shelburne Road. Timothy Follett, president of the Merchants Bank, made his fortune with canal boats. He embraced the coming of railroads and was instrumental in the development of the Rutland Railroad, which laid tracks from Boston through Bellows Falls and north to the great rail yard of Rutland. Follett found himself in head-to-head competition with the Central Vermont Railroad, which came from Boston through White River and on to Montpelier and Northfield. Amid this multimodal commercial heyday and rivalry, the Plattsburgh, New York, and Montreal Railroad instigated a hostile takeover of the steamboat, the Francis Saltus. The Plattsburgh sheriff came over to Vermont and seized the boat. 100 Vermonters then stormed over to Plattsburgh to try to take her back, but as they were being beaten back, they managed to pull her silcocks and they sank her at the dock. The success of the Champlain Transportation Company attracted the attention of New York Hudson River robber baron Daniel Drew, who easily manipulated the CTC stock and illegally took over the company. Drew then sold the Champlain Transportation Company to the Rutland Railroad, ridding himself of the company's aging wood-burning fleet. But he retained the company charter to operate on the lake and immediately built a new 240-foot ship, christened the United States. The United States was the first steamship on the lake to burn coal, which made lake travel safer after decades of tragic fires that consumed passengers and steamships alike. Drew then built the even faster steamship, the Richard Sherman, and the very name guaranteed the respected captain's loyalty. Hard-pressed to compete against Drew's two new steamships, the Rutland Railroad sold the Champlain Transportation Company back to Daniel Drew for a fraction of what they had paid just 2 years before. But the railroads were changing the playing field. The Central Vermont came through Essex Junction onto St. Albans in Canada, while the Rutland Railroad came north into Burlington's waterfront. Shut off from Burlington's waterfront, the Central Vermont Railway engineered a rail connection through the Gauley from Essex Junction to Pine Street. But in the spring, the Gauley would flood, which damaged the tracks. Burlington, served by 2 railroads, would move goods to market all year round. By the late 1850s, woodworking mills that planed and finished lumber sprang up from Battery Park to Pine Street, lining the entire waterfront. The Burlington waterfront was humming with factories, lumber mills, and the pioneer shops. It was purported to be the 3rd largest lumber port in America. A tremendous amount of lumber was moved by water, and logs and rough timber continued to pour down from Canada, which fueled the Burlington economy. Stacks of lumber were so copious that they covered more than 30 acres. Much of it filled in from the lake to accommodate the demand for space. Street names were given to the travel lanes between the rows and stacks, which stretched as far as the eye could see. The Burlington Marble Company was at the foot of Marble Street, close to the water and the railroad tracks. The company was well serviced by rail and boat. The famous etching, View from the Lake, depicts the bustling Burlington lakefront in contrast to the tranquility of the fishermen. Small steamboats streamed into the harbor, bringing commuters, workers, and shoppers. And there were even a few single-occupancy vehicles. In 1860, the Central Vermont Railroad developed a uniquely strong arch, which was made with multiple layers of brick and stone to tunnel under the sand of North Avenue. This tunnel allowed them to abandon the gully and finally have access to the waterfront. This tunnel is still used today. Joining together with the Rutland Railroad, The two railroad companies built the original towering Union Station at the foot of College Street. The Central Vermont Railroad controlled the College Street dock, and their steamship named the Reindeer serviced passengers coming to and from the trains. This image of the reindeer is the only photograph that shows a lighthouse in the southern tower of the Union Station. Fear of fire may have led to its being dismantled. Looking down from Battery Park, the horse-drawn carriages, taxis of their day, meet the steamship the Reindeer, and the rooftops of the pioneer shops extend southward from the steam turbine under Battery Park that powered them all. There was a jetty extending towards the Central Vermont Railroad dock at the end of College Street. This jetty created what was known as Burlington's Central Slip. It had a rail siding and freight cars that could load or unload to canal boats. Out on the breakwater there was a house for the lighthouse keeper that in 1890 was moved to Front Street in the Old North End. It is still there today. The Champlain Transportation Company's dock was located at the foot of King Street, where its ferries still dock today. There were many slips and docks at this time that serviced the canal boats. Imagine the raw power that brought a 250-foot steamer into the landing. The engineer manually paused the huge walking beam that drove the piston-powered side wheels. He had to catch that moment before the downward stroke when the beam was horizontal, and then thrust the mechanism out of gear to pause the side wheels so that the man in the wheelhouse could heel the ship broadside and glide her safely to the dock. Today we can only marvel at the shipbuilding skill that went into these boats, like the filigree covers over the side wheels, or the finish of the interiors of these stately ships reflecting their gilded age. This grandeur was mirrored in the private rail cars of the era that sparkled with rich appointments. The Delaware and Hudson Railroad bought the Champlain Transportation Company. They built a rail spur so their passengers could move seamlessly from their Lake George steamers to their Lake Champlain steamers. The president of the Delaware and Hudson Railroad, Le Grand Canon, chose to live in Burlington, and he built a grand residence overlooking the lake. Steamships had a 25-year lifespan before they were scrapped. Most often they were sunk in Shelburne Bay. It was out on the point of Shelburne Bay at the Shelburne Shipyard where the next generation of newer and bigger steamships were built. The city created Red Rocks Park south of the Waterfront and Battery Park to its north. The Waterfront continued to be Vermont's front door. Large and small steamships plied the waters, and simple ferries continued to service crossings. Steam workboats and tugs supported the marine activity. The Central Vermont Railroad's 200-foot steamship, the Reindeer, traveled each day up the Otter Creek to Vergennes to deliver and pick up passengers and freight. If churning up the bending waterway was not difficult enough, imagine her making a 180-degree turn just below the falls in Vergennes. The high water mark for the steamship era had arrived by the 1880s. And as their glory and dominance of the lake began to recede, consider the tale of the mammoth oak Ames built by the Rutland Railroad. Rutland Railroad's train tracks dead-ended in Burlington, so they put their trains onto the steamboat, which then took the trains from Burlington to Plattsburgh to service their north and west passengers. But their costs outweighed their revenue, and they sold the Oak Ames to their rival, the Champlain Transportation Company. The Oak Ames was lavishly re-outfitted as a luxurious passenger steamer and renamed the Champlain. A week into her service, she rammed at full speed onto the rocks near Westport, New York. It turns out the pilot, who swore he was awake, had taken copious amounts of laudanum, an opiate unregulated in those days. He had blacked out at the wheel, running the Champlain full steam onto the rocks. The wreck became a popular excursion point on the lake, and to this day, many lake homes have artifacts procured from a visit to the Champlain. As Burlington at its peak moved into the 1880s, the Stoner bird's-eye rendering details the waterfront's industrial layout. From the prominently featured lighthouse and the home of its keeper, to the Union Station and wharfs, and the docks stretching southward. The trolley system began as a horse-drawn system from Burlington to Winooski in the 1880s. It soon went electric as hydropower was tapped from the upper Winooski Falls. As a result, in 1886, Burlington became one of the nation's first electrified cities, boasting one of the earliest electric trolleys in America. Dr. William Seward Webb and his wife, Eliza Vanderbilt Webb, provided a focal place for recreation on the Burlington waterfront to blossom. Dr. Webb came to head up the Rutland Railroad, a gift from his father-in-law, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Dr. Webb found it difficult to park his 120-foot yacht, the Elfrida, in Burlington when he commuted from Shelburne, where he lived. So Dr. Webb purchased the right to the Central Vermont dock at the foot of College Street, and he created the Lake Champlain Yacht Club, which heralded the beginning of the recreation sport of yachting on the Burlington waterfront. The Reindeer was relegated to a new slip, the south side of the Lake Champlain Yacht Club, to make way for Dr. Webb's Elfrida. The Yacht Club, chartered in 1888, encouraged local residents to join the club and sail upon the lake. Dr. Webb was elected the club's first Commodore, and he became known from then on as Commodore Webb. When the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, Commodore Webb donated his black-hulled Elfrida to the United States Navy. He then replaced it with a larger, white Elfrida, which proudly took its place at their family dock in Shelburne. On the jetty adjacent to the yacht club, a boathouse sprung up. Modest and elegant sailing boats began to appear in the Burlington harbor. They were mostly built and stored in resident backyards. Over this same period, the people of Burlington organized an elaborate winter carnival that featured a sled race down Main Street on travois sleds. Folks would speed through the finish line and out onto the lake. For many years, this winter carnival boasted an assortment of winter events that involved the entire Burlington community. But this vibrant city was not without its economic woes. In 1889, the vibrant humming factories of the waterfront were engulfed by a horrendous fire that destroyed most of the industrial waterfront. Although the train station and the yacht club survived the fire, most of the waterfront burned to the ground. It took years to rebuild, and it never reached its historic density. The original Burlington Union Station survived the fire, but its stately arches were destroyed, and reinforced steel replaced the arches. Rutland's attractive and historic train station remained in operation until the early 1960s, when it was demolished. In St. Albans during the 1960s, they demolished the train barn, but retained Central Vermont Railroad's stately main office building. In Burlington, the electric trolley system soon integrated seamlessly with the trains at the foot of College Street. This offered a multimodal system vastly superior to anything we have today. The great steamships of Lake Champlain were built and wintered at the Shelburne shipyard. Every winter, these magnificent ships were winched ashore by draft horses. When the 19th century came to a close, a new generation of single-stack steamships were launched. The Vermont, the Chateauguay, and the Ticonderoga. At the beginning of the 20th century, Vermont embarked on its own big dig. The Rutland Railroad, still trying to expand out of Burlington, pushed a causeway out to the Champlain Islands so that its trains could reach Rouse's Point and Montreal. Vice President Teddy Roosevelt went to the islands by boat while the project was underway. He was rowed out to Commodore Webb's Alfreda for a bit of duck hunting. However, President McKinley was assassinated, and Vice President Teddy Roosevelt was brought back by the Alfreda to Burlington's King Street dock and rushed by private train to Buffalo to be sworn in as the next President of the United States. Teddy Roosevelt, now President, did not end McKinley's protectionist tariffs that taxed goods coming into America. Since 1890, trade with Canada was strangled by these tariffs. As commercial trade with Canada stopped, the economic vitality for the canal boaters was hindered. Canal boating became less and less viable as a way of life for lake people. With the dawning of the new century, commercial lake travel diminished. More and more goods were being shipped by rail instead of by boat, and people began using the lake more as a recreational resource. Burlington basked in a tranquility that seemed to wash over its waterfront. With the new century, the city changed its focus inland, east, towards the Green Mountains, and the waterfront became more and more its backyard. A dozen boathouses replaced the rail cars on the Central Slips jetty. The yacht club, which survived the Great Fire of 1889, burned down in the early 1900s. It was replaced by a much smaller and much more modest building. Burlington's waterfront was now a place for increased fleets of pleasure boats and recreational activity. The canal boat traffic, although greatly reduced, did continue to operate into the 20th century. Primarily, this commercial activity was taking place through the Champlain Canal to and from the New York markets. Dwarfed next to the steamship Ticonderoga, the little black steam launch Daisy was the workhorse for the Champlain Transportation Company. The shanty and the ice house buildings are easily recognized at the foot of King Street. Compared to the last century, the Burlington waterfront was a quiet and sleepy place. In 1909, Burlington hosted the 300th anniversary tercentenary celebration of Samuel D. Champlain's discovery of the lake. More than 30,000 people turned out to hear President William Howard Taft presiding over this historic event. Essex Junction, as part of the celebration, offered their town's 100-year vision, showing what things would look like in 2009. An overhead rail to Westford, a trolley that goes out to Jericho, a subway to Burlington, and a dirigible to Plattsburgh. Although the automobile had been created, they were not affordable or widely used. The future was mass transit. Trolleys provided the transit for people to return home from the Essex Fairgrounds. In Shelburne, the Rutland Railroad had dual tracks, and Commodore Webb built an elaborate train station to serve them. The end of an era, this last and lonely steam tug tows a final load of lumber down from Canada. The Burlington waterfront now is conspicuously devoid of stacked lumber. The city's water system was being developed and improved for its citizenry, and the times they were a-changing. In 1913, the Shepherd and Morse Lumber Company fire destroyed most of the remaining lumber industry landmarks. The fire burned down the yacht club, and for the third time, the Lake Champlain Yacht Club was rebuilt on the 100-year-old pilings. Local passenger lake travel continued on Lake Champlain, although it was dramatically diminished. In 1915, the old train station was torn down to make way for Burlington's new modern Union Station at the foot of Main Street. The building's character and design was chosen from a catalog and depicts a station that was designed for Santa Fe, New Mexico. The harsh reality of modern times arrived in the next year when America entered World War I. The Champlain Transportation Company ferried soldiers from Burlington to the Delaware and Hudson Rail Line in Port Henry, New York. There was little traffic on the once vibrant canals, except to pick up scrap metal for the war effort. When World War I was over, Henry Ford's automobile industry created the affordable Model T. The waterways, once our highways, now were obstacles the automobiles needed to cross. People now had more leisure time to relax and recreate at public places like North Beach, where even seaplanes were known to land. Looking west from the Ethan Allen Tower over North Avenue to Apple Tree Point, there were open fields and just a few houses. If you climbed up the tower at St. Paul's Cathedral and looked south, you could see City Hall Park, the Hotel Vermont, and its sister hotel, the Van Ness House on the corner of Main and St. Paul Streets. Increased bus and automobile travel forced the state to improve their roads. New York State completed a bridge over Lake Champlain at Crown Point. It was after the flood of 1927 that the State Road Division adopted the slogan, "Get Vermont out of the mud." The Route 2 causeway in the 1920s was barely passable. By 1930, it had become passable, and by 1938, it was a modern road. In the summer of 1929, just before the stock market crash, thousands of people gathered in City Hall Park to cheer the burning of the last trolley car. The era of light rail had come to an end, and the tracks were torn up in a frenzy of enthusiasm for modern buses and cars. With the height of the Great Depression, the Burlington Yacht Club began sinking into the lake due to neglect. With the rise of the automobile, the Burlington waterfront began its decline, which lasted over 50 years. During the 1930s, the Champlain Transportation Company also settled into decline, but a new demand for ferries to move automobiles across the lake offered an opportunity for a commercial shipping company. The Champlain Transportation Company's steamship, the Chateauguay, lost her detailed filigree around the side wheels in order to look more modern. And when the Burlington Yacht Club was condemned as unsafe, the members voted to rent the Chateauguay and tire alongside the yacht club and move their parties aboard. And then the ultimate indignity. The Champlain Transportation Company stripped the Chateauguay down and converted her to an automobile ferry. And when she proved too expensive to operate as an automobile ferry, she was dragged out of the water, cut into pieces, and her hull shipped by rail to New Hampshire's Lake Winnipesaukee, where she was refitted and christened the Mount Washington. She resides there to this day. The Ticonderoga became the last of the steamships to ply Lake Champlain. A local entrepreneur, Horace Corbin, put men to work on the vacant north end of the waterfront and built new economical car ferries. His first car ferry was named the City of Burlington. As she slid down the ways into the lake, she stuck fast in the mud. In order to pull the automobile ferry out of the mud and into the lake, the Ticonderoga was brought to the rescue to pull the ferry out of the mud and into the lake. The City of Burlington ferry was followed by the City of Plattsburgh ferry. They were so successful that within a year, Corbin bought the CTC, changing its name to the Lake Champlain Transportation Company we know today. Gasoline was being transported up the lake and into the Burlington Harbor. There was great demand for pumping facilities and storage tanks. Pipelines extended to dolphin buoys located in the lake, some of which are still there today. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, took on the project of rejuvenating Battery Park, which had become run down during the Depression. The Island Flyer train was a commuter train that came down from the Champlain Islands. It was a commuter train for workers and students who rode it daily to Burlington schools. Mail was sorted on and came by railroad, and the Railway Express delivered freight every day to the train station in Burlington, and then the railroad company's trucks, like today's UPS, would deliver it. The Shelburne Shipyard reopened during World War II. The shipyard made sub-chasing patrol boats for the Navy, providing jobs for hundreds of people. The end of World War II brought a peaceful renewal as soldiers returned home to Vermont. Burlington's bus station was refurbished. There was very little happening on the Burlington waterfront. Some traditional recreations were still as popular as ever, but the pace of recreation was, like the 1950s itself, very laid back. Things were quiet and peaceful from the Champlain Transportation Company at the foot of King Street to the summer camps like Brown Ledge in Mallett's Bay. The Moran coal-fired electric plant was built during this time, and it included the construction of an elaborate pier that offered some public access to the lake. The Ticonderoga continued providing lake travel for its passengers, although there were very few of them. Champlain Transportation Company sold the Ticonderoga to Electra Webb. She was the philanthropist and founder of Shelburne Museum. Mrs. Webb continued to run the Ticonderoga as a summer excursion vessel. After a few years of operation, the insurance costs and lack of experienced crew forced Mrs. Webb to consider a radical plan for the Ticonderoga's preservation. At the end of the summer of 1952, the Ticonderoga began her last voyage to the Shelburne Museum to the landlocked site she occupies today. Hauled out of the water and placed on flat railroad cars, the Ticonderoga inched its way to the Shelburne Museum. This took an entire winter to conclude because the rail lines were placed one by one in front of the boat to facilitate its overland journey. During the mid-1960s, urban renewal targeted the destruction of a tightly knit Italian neighborhood. Homes were leveled from the west of Battery Street all the way to St. Paul Street. Only the building south of Main Street survived the wrecking ball. By the 1990s, much of the urbanized district had been rebuilt. Throughout the 1960s, recreational uses resurfaced at the Burlington waterfront. Gasoline was the last major bulk cargo to be freighted up through the canal system. Old industrial scars still dominated the waterfront's landscape. In the 1990s, following the lead by Main Street Landing's sustainable development, a private-public partnership emerged that has led to today's multi-use, pedestrian-friendly waterfront. A buoy, placed just off the southern end of the breakwater, can guide you underwater to a site that echoes the waterfront's past. Consider the General Butler. In December of 1876, Captain Montgomery risked the cold and dangerous December weather to bring his last load of marble down from Isle Lamont. He allowed his teenage daughter and her friend to accompany him so they could do some Christmas shopping in Burlington. Caught in an unexpected and horrendous winter gale while approaching the Burlington harbor, the boat's steering mechanism snaps, and Montgomery and his deckhand, they manage to throw out a storm anchor in a vain attempt to keep the vessel from being dashed on the stone breakwater. The shore was crowded with horrified people witnessing the General Butler getting smashed onto the rocks. Captain Montgomery grabs his daughter and her friend and throws them onto the ice-crusted, wave-swept breakwater as he and his deckhand leap just in time to watch their canal boat sinking to the bottom of the lake. Huddled on the ice-covered breakwater with huge, freezing cold waves crashing all around them, their lives were hanging in the balance. With heroic and quick thinking, James Wakefield and his son jumped into a longboat and rowed out through the storm to the ice-covered breakwater. William Montgomery threw his daughter and her friend into the arms of James Wakefield. Then he and his deckhand managed to board the lurching longboat, and everyone was brought back safely to shore amidst the loud applause and cheers from the overjoyed people. The history of Burlington's waterfront was an important aspect of Main Street Landing's visioning process, and it guided us through the creation of 150,000 square feet of built environment on Burlington's waterfront. Our acclaimed redevelopment projects became the catalyst for most future development on the Burlington Harbor. Our commitment to environmental development practices and our focus on strong social justice have helped inspire sustainable private and public development throughout the country.